over the course of 20 years, I'd made so many mistakes. So the idea started with how can I translate those mistakes into, learnings that anyone could really apply so that not everyone has to go through these same hard lessons. But beyond that, right, the idea was we really had to make sure it was generalizable to organizations, whether they were startups or larger organizations. And so this is where, I started testing this approach with different kinds of companies, different industries, etc.
Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Just sit back, relax, and learn from the leaders of today. It's a journey. Each one is different, unique, inspiring. Let's get started. This episode is powered by J Ventures, a community-driven VC fund in Silicon Valley, in partnership with Lomitech, and sponsored by Homeward Ventures, Hippo Insurance, Upwest, Hillel at Stanford, Leap, and Birthright Excel. Hello and welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. I am joined today by Radhika Dutt, author of Radical Product Thinking, the new mindset for innovating smarter. She's an entrepreneur and product leader. She has participated in 4 acquisitions, 2 of which were companies that she founded. She has built products in industries including broadcasting, media, advertising technology, government, consumer, robotics, and wine. Dutt advises organizations from high-tech startups to government agencies on building radical products that create a fundamental change instead of optimizing the status quo. She also teaches entrepreneurship and innovation at Northeastern University's the Moore McKean School of Business. Radhika Dutt, welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on, Michael.
Thank you very, very much for being here. Radhika, I'm so excited to talk to you about this idea of radical product thinking. And your whole journey is so fascinating around that. And, as I'm looking at my personal journey and that of my friends and colleagues, one of the big questions that we keep asking ourselves is how do we create these radically innovative products? And, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Sergey and Larry Page, and what's happening, with product design thinking, radical mindsets, and you're writing a book that is coming out tomorrow. You're teaching at Northeastern Business School. You yourself studied bachelor's and master's at MIT, a part of 4 acquisitions and startups that are ranging amongst very, very different categories. And so I'm really excited to dive deep into your own background in these 20 minutes, as well as the book that is coming out, and talking a little bit about product development and creativity and innovation. And so, Radhika, maybe we can start off. Tell me a little bit about, your own curiosity and what is it really that you're so deeply curious about?
The quest for this methodology and this approach, right? It all started because of my own experiences having been an entrepreneur. So, my first startup was something that I started along with a few other school classmates. So we were still in dorm rooms when we started our first startup. And, one of the first things that happened was we had raised money, but we caught what I call product diseases. One of the diseases we caught was hero syndrome. And this was back in 2000. And by the way, 20 years later, I still find that those diseases that we'd caught back then, they're still just as common. So hero syndrome is the disease, one of the 7 diseases I mentioned in the book, where hero syndrome is what we catch when we're so focused on scale, on being big, on this idea of go big or go home. What happens is we conflate finding funding with success, or we conflate scale with having a successful product. And this is exactly what we ran into in my first startup. And the quest, for building better products really came about because I was driven by the question, is it that there are just a few people who can build world-changing products and the rest of us are kind of doomed to just learning from trial and error? Or can we actually build successful products very systematically? Because one of the things that, in Silicon Valley or just in the startup world, what we keep hearing is the way you build products is iterate fast, try lots of things and see what works. And, that's kind of the recipe for building successful products. And I realized that was not quite the right approach. It's almost like, there are a few startups that hit jackpot by taking this approach, but it's the equivalent of the strategy of, let's play the slot machines to get funding kind of strategy. It just doesn't work, statistically speaking. And so what we need is a more systematic approach, and that's how this came about.
And so you transition from building companies and being an entrepreneur to thinking about these things more holistically and critically. What does that transition mean to you? That do you see that as complementary to the entrepreneurial side of you, this strategic thinking, now teaching in business school? Was it a specific trigger that led you down this path to go 30,000 feet in the air and try to map the landscape and not just take your own case studies but merge with all those around you? What happened there?
Yeah, it was, as we started thinking about how do we build successful products, it was something that we needed to make sure was generalizable, that it wasn't just something very specific to my own case studies or my own examples. And what I found was that, I had, over the course of about 20 years, learned just a lot of hard lessons on how to build good products. And it was, over the course of 20 years, I'd made so many mistakes. So the idea started with, how can I translate those mistakes into, learnings that anyone could really apply so that not everyone has to go through these same hard lessons. But beyond that, right, the idea was we really had to make sure it was generalizable to organizations, whether they were startups or larger organizations. And so this is where, I started testing this approach with different kinds of companies, different industries, etc. And what I realized was, in terms of building successful products, it's not that we cannot use iteration. I'm not against the idea of iteration altogether. In fact, I use lean startup, I use agile. I find these methodologies highly useful, right? It's useful for feedback-driven execution. But the analogy I like to use is, we use iteration to drive fast, but driving fast is only useful when you actually know where you're going. And so this is why the strategic approach really needs to be combined with iterating fast. And that's kind of what this does. Until now, all the methodologies, business books, etc., that we've really internalized, right? All of those methodologies mostly talk about how we can move fast. They help us use iteration and use the speed or use the tactics of trial and error. How can we fail fast, learn fast better, right? But what we haven't had so far is a very clear methodology for defining a clear vision, for crafting a strategy. Basically, methodology so that your iterations and your execution can be driven by a vision and strategy. And that's the gap that radical product thinking fills. So in fact, it pairs really well with lean and agile, and that's how I use it with organizations.
I love it. Okay, so let's dig deep into radical, radical thinking and what's happening there with product development and building great products, and more specifically, in the system that you've developed and how that translates into some examples that we see either, in today's world, the world that we had before.
Yeah, maybe I'll share, first of all, what I mean by the difference between being vision-driven versus iteration-led, right? And I think that's a good starting point because it really illustrates why do we even need to think differently. Let's look at the example of the Tesla Model 3 versus, the Chevy Bolt, right? The difference between these two cars and kind of the vision that was behind these two cars and then what that meant in terms of the end result, I think that really illustrates the difference between vision-driven versus iteration-led. So there's a famous auto expert, Sandy Munro, who took apart these cars to really study them and compare them. And so he opens up this Chevy Bolt and, what you see under the hood is that it looks very much like a traditional gas car. And in fact, if you look at their cooling systems, there are 3 cooling systems to cool different parts of the car, one for the engine, the battery, and one for the cabin, right? Now you compare this to the Tesla Model 3. When you open the hood, it looks nothing like a traditional gas car. If you look at the cooling system specifically, right, they have one system, which they call the super bottle, that does both heating and cooling for the entire car. Now, one of the things that the that this auto expert talked about is, in Detroit, they'd always talked about having one cooling system. But the problem is, right, every one of these three elements was someone's fiefdom in Detroit. And so they really didn't put it all together into this one system. The whole of this Chevy Bolt is basically a small iteration of what Detroit already knew, which was gas cars. On the other hand, if you look at the Tesla, Sandy Munro describes it as being revolutionarily different. And the sales speak for themselves. The Tesla Model 3 is outselling, the BMW 3 Series, the Mercedes C-Class Plus, the Audi A4 combined, right? Whereas the Chevy Bolt is doing okay. It's doing well. And if you think about kind of where it all starts, let's look at the vision that drives these two cars. That's where the fundamental difference starts. So the Tesla Model 3 is driven by a vision for the change that the company wanted to bring about, which was to create an affordable car that didn't require a compromise from the driver to go green. Whereas if you look at the Chevy Bolt, right, there was a very different vision that led to it. It was driven by a business goal. And that business goal was beating Tesla Model 3 to market with a range of over 200 miles. And so these two very different visions. One is a vision for change in the world. The other is a vision for a corporate goal. Those two visions led to a very different end product. And this is what I mean by what I want us to do differently, right? Instead of a business goal that's driving every aspect of your product, what we really need to start with is a vision for the change we want to see in the world. And then we very systematically translate that so that every part of our product reflects that vision. And what happens today, right, is we haven't had this methodology to be very systematic so that there's no break in the chain between the vision all the way to your everyday actions and to every element of your product. And that, because that's been missing, whenever there's that break in the chain, that's where product diseases creep in. And so this whole radical product thinking approach helps you do each of those steps, from vision to strategy to how that translates into everyday activities. It helps you do all of that systematically so your product becomes your mechanism to create the change you want to see in the world.
Right. And I think that one of the things that I'm, immediately thinking about is, I guess that one of the implications, what you're saying is that, through an iterative process, it doesn't matter how iterative and how agile you are. If the vision is not there, if you're not innovative in your vision, then you're out of the game. You'll iterate on the wrong vision and you won't end up as a winner at the end. And so I love that example. And now let's focus then on the vision aspect. How do you actually, create an environment in which you can build visionary products and have that type of mentality?
I think the first thing is we have to unlearn some of the things that we've learned until now, right? It's things that have been so deeply embedded in us. The first thing where we need to start is what do we mean by a good vision? Until now, everything that we've always learned about a good vision is that it has to be a BHAG. That's the most common term we use in the VC world, right? That it has to be a big, hairy, audacious goal. We say that a good vision has to be short, a slogan, so people can remember it. And I want us to really step away from all of those conventional ideas. The reason is this. When you have just a BHAG for a vision, it's just not detailed enough to be able to drive your iterations. And so instead, in the radical way, we have to have a very detailed vision that helps you define the problem statement and your solution to the problem. So the way to do that is to answer 5 questions: the who, what, why, when, and how. So the first question is, whose world are you trying to change? It can't just be everyone or like consumers or, businesses. It has to be a very specifically identifiable group of people. What is their problem? Meaning, what does their world look like today? And what's their solution that they're using today? The third question, and this one is probably the most important one to me, is why does that status quo need changing? Why is it completely unacceptable? Because the reality is, right, unless the status quo is unacceptable, maybe there's no reason for your product to exist. The fourth question then is, when will you know that you've arrived? Meaning, what does the world look like when you can say mission
Right.
accomplished? And then finally, this is where we
Yes.
can talk about our own product or technology. The last question is, how will you bring that about? And that's where you can say, here's what your product is going to do. And so in the radical product thinking way,
Right.
I use these 5 questions, but in a fill in the blank statement so that we don't play vision bingo and, deal with buzzwords. Instead, we just focus on answering these questions in a fill in the blank statement. So if you like, I'm happy to share an example of what that would sound like.
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
Okay. So I'll use the startup that I had as an example. So it would read like this. Today, when amateur wine drinkers want to find wines that they're likely to like, they have to try attractive looking wine bottles or wines that are on sale. This is unacceptable because it leads to so many disappointments. We envision a world where finding wines you like is as easy as finding movies you like on Netflix. We're bringing about this world through a recommendations algorithm that matches wines to your taste and an operational setup that delivers these wines to your door. So this is the entire vision statement, right? And I realize it sounds more like an essay than a slogan, but here's the power of it. I had told you absolutely nothing about my startup, but hopefully, sharing this vision statement told you exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it.
Yes.
And that is what you want in a radical vision.
100%. No, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, once you have that, what are sort of the side effects of this? So now that you have this radical vision, then does this sort of become, the vision for the company that is also helping align the employees? Is this, at what point do you think this is, a critical step for a startup to do? Is it in the beginning? Is it as they're finding product market fit in there and they're iterating on a bunch of different problem sets? What is the sweet spot for this?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this, because that's the other conventional wisdom that we learn, right? That your vision is unchanging. You set your vision at the beginning and it never changes. And that's one of the most important things we need to challenge, because as a startup, the reality is you're learning so much every single day. So the way I use this with startups is, when you start out, use this as a stake in the ground. Write out a vision statement saying, this is what you think the problem is, and what you think the world should look like. But the reality is, right, a month later, if you're an early stage startup, you might discover that you were completely wrong a month ago, right? But then go back and revisit that statement and you can rewrite the answers to those questions and you have a new vision statement. But the most important thing is, instead of just pivoting left and right and catching the product disease pivotitis, you're really going to be able to align your team because you're helping them understand what was it that we learned, what is no longer true, and what is the new vision. And so you do this, as often as you need to. The reality is, as an early stage startup, you might want to revisit your vision every month because your pace of learning is just so incredibly fast. As if you're a mature company, you might need to do this every 6 months, maybe every year or so. But that frequency is kind of super important, and you have to decide what's right for you. But we have to begin to treat our vision statement as a hypothesis, and then our execution and our iterations, they're all there to help us prove out this vision and our strategy, etc.
And that makes a lot of sense. And Radhika, I really want to thank you for joining. These 20 minutes went by very, very fast, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with me. And congratulations on the launch of your new book. By the time this airs, the book will have been out already, and so I'm excited to purchase and read it myself. So thank you very, very much. Now I want to take you back for just a couple minutes, back to your childhood and about yourself. Growing up, what really sparked your curiosity? What really, made you curious about the world?
What made me curious about the world? I think that was just a way of being for me. It was being curious about the things around me, just wanting to learn more. I think what was also deeply, profoundly influential that shaped me was living in different places. I moved around a lot as a child. I lived in different cities in India, but then I also moved to South Africa. This was actually during the transition from apartheid to democracy. All of these things really shaped my worldview and the desire to just learn more about people, cultures, and so on. And that's part of me today.
I love it. And if you look today on what inspires you in the work that you do, whether it's, Northeastern, or whether it's with the startups that you work with, or anything like that, what really inspires you?
What really inspires me is this desire that we can build products that also embrace responsibility. We've learned for so long that the way you build products, just try what works in the market and build it, find product market fit. We don't think so much about, well, how are our products affecting society? And in the book, I talk about, 5 different types of digital pollution that I've realized that the world is dealing with today. I think if we think about environmental pollution and how the industrial boom led to environmental pollution, we're facing something very similar where in the digital era, we've created digital pollution. And we need to build products that don't affect society negatively. And in the book, I really talk about how we can take this Hippocratic oath of product. And that inspires me because, if I think about a lot of the generation today, I hear kids talk about how they don't want to bring new life into the world because they feel like it wouldn't be good for the world or good for their kids to experience the hardships in the world, right? Like I was thinking about how growing up, I always felt like technology was going to make the world a better place. And a lot of this new generation doesn't feel that way anymore. And so it's a tremendous responsibility that I think, people who are graduating college now face, that we need to build products that make the world a better place, so that for the next generation too, they can feel like technology is creating a better world. And that inspires me. We have the ability to do that. We can take responsibility and build products that also make the world a little more like the one we want to live in.
I love it. And what are a few words that you would use to describe yourself?
Okay, let's think. I think 3 words. The first is thoughtful or mindful, because I realized that building products gives us a superpower. The second is being vision driven. I think it took me a long time to become more vision driven, but I think as I have kind of grown in my career, I realized that I have a vision for what I want to do, and I've increasingly learned to be more vision driven. And I guess the last one is sheer persistence. So I'm extremely persistent, and you kind of have to be like that, I guess, as an entrepreneur. So yeah, I guess those are 3 words to describe me. So thoughtful, persistent, and vision driven.
I love it. Radhika, thank you so much. This was so great. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and share this with me. And it leaves me with great optimism. So thank you very much. Congratulations on the new book. And I can't wait to read it myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure, Michael.